Hi everyone, just a couple quick announcements before we get started. We're still having our holiday sale, which is 20% off all downloads in our store through the end of the month. We are currently doing our holiday giving drive. We're almost to the halfway point and we have a little over 2 weeks left. So if you can help us reach our $25,000 goal, that would be really great. You can just go to jungchicago.org/give. Thanks to everyone who has given already. And if you're thinking about making a contribution, you would be supporting the Institute and helping everyone who receives this podcast for free. Also, if you are thinking of applying for the Analyst Training Program, the deadline is January 15th, so you have about a month left. Much of it is done online, so if you just go to jungchicago.org/ATP, all the information you need about applying is there. Thanks. Welcome to the Jungian Anthology podcast from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Jung in the World, Jung's Two Personalities and Their Impact on Jungian Thought and Training with Mark Saban. Mark Saban joins us to talk about the complexity of Jung's own personality and how that has shaped the way analysts are trained today. Mark Saban is a psychotherapist, analytical psychologist, and Jungian analyst in the UK. He is a senior analyst with the independent group of analytical psychologists and registered as a Jungian analyst with the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy and the International Association for Analytical Psychology. He gained an MA at Oxford University and worked for 20 years as a performer and writer in theater, TV, and film before training as an analytical psychologist. He completed his PhD at the University of Essex, where he also works as a lecturer in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies. He is the author of Two Souls, Alas, Carl Jung's Two Personalities, and the Making of Analytical Psychology. Patricia Martin is interviewing him as part of this series, and her full bio is in the show notes. Now here's the interview.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and welcome to Jungian Anthology. I'm a professional affiliate at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, and I'll be your host today. In this series, we'll be talking with people whose work intersects with Jung's ideas to tell a more contemporary story of his enduring impact in a brave new world. In this interview, I'm joined by Mark Saban, a Jungian analyst in private practice working out of Oxford, England. Mark also enjoys teaching Jungian studies at the University of Essex. His book, Two Souls, Alas, Carl Jung's Two Personalities and the Making of the Analytic Psychology, has won several awards. He joins us today to talk about the complexity of Carl Jung's own personality and how that has shaped the way analysts are trained today. Welcome, Mark. You're the author of several books, but the one that fascinated me is Two Souls, Alas, Jung's Two Personalities and the Making of Analytic Psychology. I know that a writer is very specific when he or she chooses a title. So Two Souls, Alas, intrigued me. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your intentions were when you chose that title?
Yes. The quote, it's a quotation from Goethe's Faust, which was a work that we know Jung very much admired and was inspired by, and had a lifelong relationship with. It just leapt out at me, that particular line leapt out at me as being absolutely, summarizing really exactly what I'm attempting to unpack in the book, which is to I mean, I'll talk a bit later. I hope about the kind of background to where the book came from for me and why I wanted to write it. But in brief, I take the first few chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung's memoir. He talks at some length about his struggles with what he describes as his two personalities, which he imaginatively calls personality number one and personality number two. And the struggle that he underwent, flipping from one personality to the other, and eventually coming to the conclusion that he really, in order to be a whole person, to live a whole life, he absolutely needed to somehow allow both these personalities to be present in his life, which is not an easy thing. We're not talking about an easy kind of integration. Just stick the two together and then move on. They're opposites, so they're difficult opposites, and so it was a struggle for Jung. But it continued to be a struggle. I think this is one of the other points I try to make in the book, is that this doesn't stop. He doesn't sort of grow out of this problem. It's a problem that continues right the way through his life, and indeed his creative life, and ultimately his psychology revolves around exactly these problems that emerge out of this difficult tension between these two dimensions of life, if you like. Two souls, alas, it's alas because it's tough. It's not an easy path. And because, I mean, the way I see it anyway, it's interminable. You don't get there. There's no wonderful achievement at the end. There's no wonderful goal where you arrive and yes, I've done it, now I'm individuated. I don't believe that ever happens. I don't think there is such a thing. I think as long as you're alive, this tension continues, and indeed it's out of this tension that life comes, and the creativity of life and really being alive. That's the way I see it, and I think that's pretty well the way Jung sees it. I hope so anyway. So that was the kind of inspiration. That line just seemed to me to really encapsulate this difficult tension.
Well, when I read your introduction, it was very clear to me that you had done your homework on the context in which analytical psychology was born, and Jung's role in that, and what that context looked like. And it came to you at some point that while you had learned a lot from that, it was time to really focus on Jung. So what I'm curious about is, why did you want to do all that homework? Why did you want to write this book?
Yes, well, that came out of something that I'd been working as a Jungian analyst for a number of years. And I'd also had a sort of sideline in teaching about Jung. I first of all started teaching on a drama therapy course. I taught the students there about Jung, and I realized that I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed the interaction, I enjoyed the connection, which made a change from the kind of slightly lonely life of being an analyst. And I realized that the other reason I liked teaching, apart from the fact that it meant that I was kind of with people and interacting with people in this way, was that I couldn't teach it without understanding it. And I realized quite quickly that the things that I thought I understood, I maybe didn't understand quite so well. So it kept taking me back to working on this stuff. And one of the things that kept coming back for me as a problem is this idea of the opposites. So as you know, you can't open a page of Jung without finding him sort of referring to this, what he calls the problem of the opposites, or the opposites. The opposites comes up all the time. And yet when I kind of looked around for a book on this, I thought, well, I'll get some help from somewhere. But I couldn't really find anything out there. I couldn't find, there weren't very many articles that looked at this question, and there were no books. So I thought, well, there's a gap in the market. Somebody really should take a look at this and work it up a bit. And after a while, my interest in teaching extended. So I found myself teaching at the University of Essex in a relatively small way at that stage. And after a while, I started thinking, well, there are two things I'd like to do here. One is I had an ambition. I wanted at some point to write a book, and this felt like my topic for some reason. This felt like something that I, for the reasons I've mentioned, this was something that I wanted to get into. But I also wanted to get a PhD. I wanted to do more teaching, and I wanted to have, be involved in the academic life slightly more. So I thought, well, I need a PhD in order to do that. So, kill two birds with one stone. I'll do the PhD, and the PhD will be, what comes out of the PhD will be the book. And so, and that obviously, as you can imagine, involved me in taking it pretty seriously in terms of research. So I really did have to get down to it in terms of researching the topic. And I immediately, I sort of dived in the deep end, because the idea of the opposites, crops up in all sorts of different arenas. But I mean, particularly in philosophy, comes up in linguistics as well. And so I kind of explored all that. I wrote this huge, detailed first chapter, as it was supposed to be, all about Aristotle and the excluded middle, and Schelling and Hegel and what have you. And then after a while, I realized that this wasn't taking me anywhere near Jung. It was, if anything, I was heading off into the ether. And I thought, well, this isn't going to work, so I can't do that. So I mean, I'm glad I did that research, but I then thought, well, I've got to really ground this in Jung. And if you ground it in Jung, that doesn't mean grounding it necessarily in his ideas, although that's obviously part of it. It means grounding it in Jung's life, Jung's experience. Because one thing I have found about Jung is that his ideas all stem from his life. He lives this stuff. He lives it first, and then he develops the ideas. Some thinkers, yeah.
Well, the thing that was also fascinating to me about that is, he admits that he says in an open speech.
He's proud of it. Yeah, I mean, he thinks that, and that's what he constantly calling himself an empiricist, and I think that's what he means more than anything else. He means this stuff is grounded in my life. I didn't just think it up and then sort of look around to see if it fitted. I lived it, and then the idea emerged from the living, which is a strength. I think that is a strength. In psychology, anyway.
In a mechanistic, scientific world, there would be people who say no.
Absolutely.
Right? That it's not empirical enough if it's coming from you. Yeah.
But isn't that interesting? Experience. Absolutely. But immediately one gets into these two opposites again, because you've got this kind of scientific, mechanistic, the worshipping of the objective, separation of the observer and the thing observed, and so on. You've got that side of science, but Jung, he doesn't reject that. It's not that he says, no, that's all nonsense. I've intuited the truth about things, and that's all you need to pay it. He's not a prophet in that sense. He doesn't kind of say he's had a vision and here it is. I mean, he does do that, but he also is very keen to connect it to the other aspect of science, this scientific, the rigor of science, if you like. He wants it to be rigorous. And the place where the two meet, I think, is in this idea of experience, because it's objectively true. He does have the experience. Psychological life is something that is real, as he continually insists on. Now, these are realities, but they don't quite, if you look at science or knowledge in a one-sided way, you end up with this rather denuded, one-sided, thin version, which is this mechanistic version of science. So that's not enough on its own. You need the other side. But then you've got the difficulty of how do you fit these two things together? Because they're not natural bedfellows. Because as you say, the scientists, the strict scientists will immediately dismiss all that and say, well, then there's no room for that in science. So he's trying to do this thing of bring these two difficult things together in some way. And it's out of that, I think, again, out of that tension between the two that his science, if you like, analytical psychology, emerges. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. But it's a struggle. Again, it's a constant struggle to keep these two together.
Well, I was thinking about that when, at the top of our conversation, you were talking about how the balancing of these two souls, the balancing of these two personalities is ever present in our lives. So in other words, we're always emergent. We're always emerging.
Exactly.
And yet, individuation is a Jungian theory that is, very much premised on getting somewhere eventually. Eventually the person, if they're attuned, they become more whole. There is a prize at the end of the struggle. So how does individuation and this idea of the two types, the kind of the warring of the two types or balancing the two types, how do those concepts fit together? Or maybe they don't at all?
No, I think they do. But I think the way I think it works is that, I mean, I see individuation. I'm absolutely with you. I think individuation is the kind of central concept in analytical psychology. I think that's the key. The absolute. Everything revolves around individuation. It seems to me. Now, individuation is very much a process. So it's all about it's all about change. It's about change. It's about transformation. It's all about transformation. Now, the kind of motor of transformation in individuation is actually, again, this same. He talks about the transcendent function. The transcendent function, which is a crucial notion, I think, for individuation, is what emerges out of, again, this difficult coming together of opposites. You find yourself in a situation. Well, I mean, there are various kind of models that he uses, but one is that you find yourself in a difficult situation. You don't know, you can't go one way, you can't go the other way, and he says what you need to do is endure this tension. Just sit with it, and eventually, as if by magic, this transcendent function occurs, and you find you've moved on to another level. At which point, the original tension between the two alternatives no longer seems relevant in a way. You're in a new place now. You see things in a different way, and so you move on. And the process of individuation is that happening again and again and again and again. But you're right, there is the notion of a goal, but I think it's a temporary goal. It's always a temporary, for me anyway. It's always a temporary goal. You get somewhere, and you think, wow, that hey, this is phew, I've emerged. I am somewhere now. I am me now, and somehow I'm not stuck in that earlier phase where things were difficult and I felt split. Now I feel that I've come back together again, in a sense. But of course, almost immediately, the next problem emerges because there's going to be something else along the line. So you have your dream, and some horrible shadow figure turns up, and then you're tackling that, and it's the next thing along, and you keep. And so when Jung talks about this, the process of individuation, as he talks about it in a kind of slightly linear way, which some people don't like. But I mean, what he says you start off dealing with the shadow, and then you deal with you start off with the persona, then you move on to the shadow, then you move on to the anima or animus, and then you move, and so on. There's a map in a way. Now, I mean, in my experience, it doesn't quite work out as simply as that. But I think his point is that you deal with these problems as you go along, and you find a kind of solution to the problems, but then the next problem comes along. So it's the next stage of individuation occurs. And I'm not really convinced that there's a final stage in individuation. I'm not sure you ever really get there. So for my money, the emphasis should be on the process. It's always the process. And the process always involves this dealing with whatever one wants to call it, the other, the unknown, the unconscious. It's when it comes down to it, this meeting of conscious and unconscious. Because another model he uses for the idea of the transcendent function is the idea of active imagination. And so in active imagination, your conscious ego is meeting the unconscious, and that's a difficult tension as well. As anyone who's ever tried knows, it's not easy. But if you can hold that, if you can somehow enable that to happen, then this something again emerges out of it, moves you along, takes you to a new place. As we read in the Red Book. I mean, the Red Book is this fantastic sort of journey in which Jung does exactly that, and he comes up against all these problems again and again. He comes up, and they're difficult problems, and personified in the case of the Red Book, which is helpful.
So I'm curious about your journey. I'm imagining that a book of this depth is its own process of individuation. And you may have, or as Joseph Campbell says about the hero's journey, you may have found yourself having a few aha moments. Were there any moments in writing this book that still stand out to you as, either that gestalt moment or that surprising moment when you discovered something about Jung that you had never considered before?
Well, I mean, I think I'll answer that by talking about the shift that happens in the book, really, because when I started the book, I'm a signed up Jungian. I trained as a Jungian analyst. I teach Jung. Obviously, I'm deeply embedded in Jung, and that's my starting point. And I wanted to write a book that was Jungian, but the interesting shift for me that happened was that I got kind of halfway through. So I explicated that went into this the way in which this worked for Jung, the way in which the tension between the two personalities, we can see something of the similar thing happening in terms of the way he develops the idea of typology. Say, again, you've got a superior function, an inferior function. It's the tension between the two is the productive thing. That's what Jung's interested in. And then he moves on to alchemy, and in alchemy again it's all about the opposites. It's all about this Mysterium Conjunctionis, right towards the end of his life, is an inquiry into the separation and synthesis of psychic opposites in alchemy. So this constant struggle never goes away. He just finds more and more complex ways to approach it and to deal with it. But what I started realizing when I really looked at the two personalities was that there were aspects of Jung's psychology and the way in which it kind of shows up in modern life, which I think I realized, I thought, started to betray a kind of one-sidedness that hadn't quite been resolved. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that the personality number two aspect of Jung, which you rightly identified early on as being the bit that Jung really, that's the bit he likes. He wants to live in personality number two. That's his comfort zone is personality number two, if you like, which kind of marks him out, because for most people it's not like that. Most people, I suspect, it's the other way around. But anyway, for Jung, this was, this arena that he describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections as God's world. He would happily have kind of lain around, read books, and communed with nature, and just been at one with eternity forever.
Right. So just for our audience, personality two is that interior personality.
Exactly. Yeah.
It goes to
so
volume.
It's the bit that's
rocks.
Exactly. I mean, he describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections these various experiences he has. There's the underground phallus dream. There's the kind of he carves this little thing and puts it in a box, and that has this special meaning for him, and so on. So there's various experiences. He sits on a stone and he wonders whether he's the one sitting on the stone or whether he's being sat on or whatever. So there are certain key experiences that sort of contribute to this sense that there is a mysterious other world which is the world somehow, and he can connect with that, and when he's connecting with that world, it's God's world, and somehow he's part of that. And so all that stuff that later I think we can see very clearly becomes his, these things become his preoccupations in his mature psychology. These are the things he's fascinated by, and of course, there's a good reason for that. There's a good excuse for that, because actually, as he points out many times, he lives in, and we live in, a culture which is one-sided the other way. So our culture is, doesn't recognize that stuff as even real. It wants to concentrate on rationality and logic and the material and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, one can understand that he's drawing attention to a dimension of things that a lot of people can't even see. So it was important to kind of, there's, he uses this word enantiodromia, which he gets from Heraclitus, which is about things. If things get too one-sided, then eventually they'll swing across the other way. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of enantiodromic process here. Things that the culture is so one-sidedly personality number one that personality number two needs to come in and kind of push in and take over for a while. But having said all that, which of course I agree with, I do think that because Jung, the man, was so caught up in this personality number two stuff and found personality number one stuff a real chore. I mean, the way he describes, he reaches this point. He has this wonderful dream, which I haven't got time to go into. But at the end of the dream, he comes to the conclusion that he's going to have to live in personality number one, and this is not good news for Jung at all. He's not keen on this, but he describes that it will mean that he'll have to. He'll have to, get involved in work and relationships and career and all that kind of, and it's going to be a real pain for him to do. You get the feeling he sees this, going ahead. But he says, but the crucial thing is, I must never forget personality number two. That has to be always there in the background, always present, and then I can do that stuff because
that was the kindling.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. It was the kindling that lit the fire that made everything else possible. But you talk about these, separateness, the separateness of these things and the coming together of these two personalities for Jung, and what a challenge that was. But it also presented a challenge for the profession of analysts and the training of analysts. And what I think you're trying to say there is, it presented a problem in that how do Jungian analysts connect with the world? How does Jungianism connect with the world?
Right.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. So this is where I go in the book. So and in a way, this is, to get back to your initial question, this was something that I didn't know was going to happen. I didn't realize that this would lead me in this direction. And I started, feeling a bit nervous about it, to be honest. I started thinking, hang on, I'm supposed to be a Jungian, and yet I'm starting, I'm developing this position which is kind of critical, and it's kind of, questioning some of the deeply held tenets of Jungian thinking. But I thought, well, how, ultimately, I come to the conclusion that this is, everything needs to individuate, and that means Jungian psychology as well. And so, of course, all I'm talking about is my relationship with Jungian psychology. That needs to individuate. That's the point. That's the main point. And that's why it matters to me, to get back to your question. That's why this felt like an important thing for me to do, because I felt I needed to engage with this niggling question that I'd started with, which blew up and became more and more of a problem. But anyway, to answer your second question, yes. So because my realization that there was a sort of one-sidedness actually in Jungian psychology led me to query how that showed itself and what that meant. And as you rightly point out, one of the ways that shows up is because there's a sort of a kind of bias in the direction of the inner, of the archetypal, that realm is felt somehow to be the crucial realm, the important bit. That's the bit that we're interested in. And as a result, the outer world and personality number one tends, he never fails to nod in the direction of it. He will say things like, of course, the process of individuation, is an inner process, but the great thing is that when you finished it, when you come out the other end, then you can go back into the world and it'll be much better. Your relationships will be better. But it seems to me that kind of, there's something missing in that, which is about it seems to me that the engagement with the world, that dimension of things, should always be, and according to his own logic of his own notion of individuation, these two things always need to be working off in tension with each other. That's the way we produce the third, as it were. That's the way the new thing comes. That needs to be the case here too. These opposites, these opposites of inner and outer, they need to be in touch with each other as well. And so this tendency to only be interested in the inner world of the patient, say, and of course one looks at the outer world, one hears about the outer world, but one tends to interpret it back into the inner world again. It's always so okay, you're having a problem with your girlfriend, but this is really an anima problem. That's the key thing here. And there's a tendency in Jung psychology to constantly draw things back into the inner world. And of course, when you get there, then what you do is you emphasize the archetypal aspect rather than the personal aspect, because again, that's the thing that Jung's interested in, and that's the thing that Jungian analysts are supposed to be interested in. But there's a danger there, I think, and the danger is that it can become a kind of self-enclosed, sort of slightly solipsistic bubble, and it excludes this important, crucial tension with the outer world. Now, I mean, the way in which I look at this in the book is to look at some of the ways in which Jung conducted analyses, and I specifically go into the case of Christiana Morgan, who was the young American woman who came over to Zurich and went into analysis with Jung, and she produced an amazing amount of visions, which eventually, were turned into the vision seminars of Jung. But if you actually look at, how this analysis proceeded, how it went, what actually happened, it starts looking more and more like a kind of folie à deux, really, because Jung constantly brings everything back to the archetypal. He's only interested in the archetypal, and you can start seeing that, if you read about this, there's quite a lot of information we have about it. You can see that the notion, the fact that she arrives in Zurich with this massive and positive transference onto Jung, which has an erotic component, and the relationship of that to her father. She had a father complex, and then Jung meets her with a kind of countertransference, which is very clear in the way he talks about her and the way he deals with her. But none of that appears to be dealt with in the analysis. It's all about him interpreting the visions, interpreting her dreams in an archetypal way. And that's
interior work.
The interior work. It's all about the interior world and the development of the interior world. And what's actually going on in the room between this woman and Jung is never, I mean, obviously we don't know exactly what happened, but it doesn't seem to have been really dealt with. And the whole thing, it goes off the rails. I mean, it goes badly wrong.
I wonder about that very issue now. I mean, we are really living in radically transformational times, right? Yes. The digital culture is here. Yeah. It's not going away, and it's changing the individuation process. That's what I see.
Absolutely.
And so, taking one's questions or issues or problems that are of a psychological nature, and they come with the big wide world of the web with them. Yeah. And bringing all of that inside, it seems like it's like swallowing a storm. I mean, as a contemporary analyst working day to day with patients, are you seeing any of this manifest with your patients? And I know you can't be specific, but just in general, what's the gestalt there?
I mean, I think the best possible example, and this you couldn't help but let this in, was the whole, is the whole pandemic, the whole COVID thing. There was this shift that really happened around the beginning of the pandemic, where I realized that not only was the whole way of doing analysis changed, because it all had to be done on Zoom and so on, or whatever. I mean, it had to be done through the internet, and that changed it in all kinds of ways that were not immediately apparent. But also just the simple fact that the thing that was on everyone's mind, and the thing that they were dealing with in an inner and an outer way, and this affected every aspect of their life, their psychic life, and every other aspect of their life, was the fact that this huge global catastrophe was going on, and to have sat with a patient and interpreted that about, so what do you think your feelings about the pandemic are saying about your inner life, and to reduce it back to that would have been impossible, actually. I mean, impossible. I think, so that was the world, that was the outer forcing its way in. I think, it kind of said, well, that's enough of this mucking around with the inner stuff. Let's, talk about this matters. But of course, then, one is left with this problem. Well, how do you talk about that? Because if all I'm used to talking about is the neuroses of my clients, and how every dream points to that, and their active imaginations, and the development of all sorts of inner relationships with inner persons, such as the anima, and so if that's what I'm used to doing, how do I turn this around and start talking about the pandemic? Because I don't want to talk about it on a kind of non-psychological way. I don't want to talk about it as, did you see the news today? This is going to happen, because then you're just having a chat. You can do that with anyone. So what can one bring psychologically? How can you make this psychological? And I think that became that's exactly the process that I think psychology needs to be doing all the time, which is bringing together this, because I'm not saying that the inner is irrelevant at all. I'm not saying that the only thing that matters is the political or the economic or the whatever catastrophe is going on. It's not that, but it needs to be seen through the other side. So the inner, the archetypal, and the outer personal need to be seen through each other. So you find a way to address what's going on using and you don't just discard all the archetypal stuff. That actually is helpful, because it offers us all kinds of ways to talk about this kind of event. But you have to be grounded in what's actually happening as well, and what that means, and because this is new stuff. This really, because it's not, this is the other thing that I think sometimes Jungian psychology, the emphasis on the archetypes leads to a kind of backward looking approach. So, because it's always about looking back to, well, yes, you're going through this problem, but I think you'll find that this myth here from 5th century Greece actually illustrates something important about that. Now, I'm not saying that isn't true. I'm sure it is true. But it starts leading one to think, well, actually, is there anything new under the sun? Because everything can be, we can find it in a Greek myth. Well, I'm not sure that's the case, because I think things do change. Like you say, I mean, things are actually transforming. These events, the world is individuating, our culture is individuating. And when you come up against something like COVID, that's exactly the sort of encounter that forces a kind of form of individuation. We're not going to be the same afterwards as we were before. So that needs to be reflected, I think, within the therapy as well. Now, I'm not saying I know how to do all this. All I'm saying is that it really highlights and points to how crucial that inner-outer engagement is. And it's always been, it's always been the case. It's just that it's particularly apparent when something like this happens.
Well, maybe that'll be your next book, Mark, and we'll have you on to talk about that in depth.
Yeah, I'll have all the answers by then. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that. And I just want to thank you for such an illuminating conversation. It's been a delight.
Good. Well. Thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to talk about it. I mean, I was very relieved to discover that even though the book actually was published in 2019, apparently I still agree with it. So that's good to know.
It still has traction, and I'm sure
Yeah,
our listeners will find it all very meaningful. Thank you, Mark.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. For more information about classes, training programs, videos, audio, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2020 donors who gave at the contributing member level and above. Barbara Anand, Usha and Ashok Beatty, Jackie Cabe Bryan, Eric Cooper and Judith Cooper, Kevin Davis, George J. Didier, Mary Doherty, James Fidelibus, John Korolewski, Marty Manning, Diane Sherwood, Deborah P. Stutzman, Deborah Tobin, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, Karen West and James Taylor, and Ellen Young. If you would like to join our generous community of supporters, just go to jungchicago.org/give.